What's going on, everybody, and welcome to episode 112 of the Book Binge, where this week I'm actually really excited for this episode for a couple reasons. Firstly, because I decided to cover this book today instead of, Dragon Reborn, because I finished that book much more recently than this one, because today is actually my birthday. I think last year I also released a video on my birthday as well, and I don't think I even mentioned it in that one. It just happened to be the case that because the Book Binge switched to being on Tuesdays this year, that I'm also releasing a video on my birthday this year as well. For my birthday, I decided to do a special episode on my favorite book of all time prior to reading Ashes of Man. It was my favorite book of 2022, so it only really held, that title of my favorite book ever for a few months. But I think it is worthy of considering as such. Like, it's still one of my favorite books I've ever read. Just straight up, I think it would probably still be number 2 even at this point. So it's not really worth, going into super specifics with this. We're covering Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. My translation that I read from was Christine, is it Doniger? I think that's how it's pronounced. If I'm mispronouncing that, I greatly apologize. But this translation was done in 2013, I believe. So it's a pretty recent translation. If I ever do a reread, I might do a reread of another translation that I have, that's been my family copy that we've had since even before I was born, I think, but it's the one that I've had my eye on since 4th grade. This was the one that I ultimately read. If I do a reread, I might do a different translation, but I just had a great time with this book. The reason that I'm excited to cover this and why I chose to do it on my birthday is because I really loved Les Mis, and amongst my friend group, that's not necessarily the most popular opinion. There are several people who just did not like it. There are some people who really liked, part of it, but then it just dragged and got worse from there. And most of their critiques I find to be valid enough that, I like to make fun of them for their opinions. I like to make fun of them for being wrong because of how much I love this book. But all things considered, a lot of those criticisms are valid, and I'm going to give this book a very fair review despite the fact that I love it so much. I will talk about some of the things that, some other people maybe didn't like so much or weren't as willing to, look over as I was. But I think I also want to go into this with a little bit of history as well. I did kind of mention having my eye on this book since 4th grade. I have wanted to read this for so long. So, I was a kid who could barely read at all back then, but this was always a book that I wanted to read, partially because it was so long. But as I've grown up and kind of learned a little bit more about it, learned a little bit more about, some of the other people who enjoy it and some of the reasons that they enjoy it, like Jean Valjean being one of Brandon Sanderson's favorite protagonists ever, if not his favorite. So, things like that made me even a little bit more excited to read it. So at last, in 2021, late 2021, I did decide to set a read-along for this book in late 2022, and it became the read-along book for November and December of 2022, I believe, in some Discord groups that I'm part of. I read it all in November, the first day of the month through the last day of the month. It was the only book that I read for the entire month, and I somehow managed to get through this behemoth in that time. The results of the read-along, as you may have been able to infer by some of the way that I've been talking about this up to this point, were a little bit more mixed, but that's fine. It was just a slam dunk for me, even if it was a little bit mixed for some other people. And that's why I'm reviewing this today. Like I mentioned, it was my favorite book of all time until I read Ashes of Man, but even then I would probably just say that they're tied for my favorite book. But it was my favorite book of 2022. Let's just get into it. I've already done enough preamble in here. Let's talk about what I think is the good of Les Mis, and several of these things I think even my friends who overall didn't really enjoy Les Mis would agree with me on. Generally speaking, character work is fantastic in Les Mis. The character relationships, the way that characters interact with each other, the internal monologues of characters, the way that characters feel, just general, broad character work within Les Mis is incredible. Victor Hugo really wrote a very human book. It covers a lot of different aspects of the human experience, or at least what I understand to be the human experience, despite, the kind of difference in when the book takes place and when the book was written versus today. There is something genuinely human about how Victor Hugo wrote these characters, and was one of the things that immediately connected me to the book. For example, this book is split into five parts, 5 volumes, depending on how you want to call them. It's like 5 different books within the book, but each one of those books is split into books. So there's, like a book 1, for example, of part 1, and it's kind of hard to explain without going into the nitty gritty, and I don't need to, but the very first 1 or 2 books of Les Mis are pretty empty of events, of things happening, but they are very engrossing. The character that you're introduced to in these books, and the things that you see from this character, and the world that is being built up with him, and him just as a character is incredible. And it like really clues you into that, like, this is something that Hugo does well. This is something that he is going to focus on through the book, and I think does so very well for every character in the book. There is a character of the book that some of my friends don't really like, Marius. They don't think he's a good character, and I personally don't fully see why. I get specific criticisms of it, but I enjoyed his character just as much as I enjoyed everybody else. But generally speaking, the character work is fantastic, especially Jean Valjean. He's the one that you really want to pay attention to. Very great stuff. One of the great things that I also found about the book, kind of on the same line, like I just gave an example of the first couple books within Les Mis just being nothing happening, but you're just engrossed. The book is very immersive. The tone, the vibe, and everything is incredible. Somehow, despite the translation being from 2013 and having a somewhat, like, it's fairly easy to read. Like, it's not a difficult translation at all. It's not a difficult book to read. This translation isn't, anyway. But still, somehow it captures the tone and the vibe of the time and the setting so well that I'm actually very surprised. And of course, some of that stuff isn't necessarily going to be changed by what year a translation takes place, but the translation is a little bit more modern than, say, the first English translation, which was done, fairly shortly after the original publication in French. So it's just the fact that I was immersed in the world, I was immersed in the setting, I was immersed in the characters' lives just so fully and deeply that I really appreciated that. The plot, as well, is incredibly well crafted. There are some things about it that necessarily don't... I can talk about this in the next section, but generally speaking, I thought that the plot was very well crafted. There are great resolutions and arcs for everyone and everything in this book. Like, there's basically nothing in it that is not covered in some degree. And sorry, I'm just going to zoom my camera in a little bit because I forgot to zoom it in after my thumbnail. It doesn't really matter. I thought that Hugo also... You could also tell how much care he put into the plotting of this book solely through, like, there's not really any mysteries per se in the book, but there are sort of quasi mysteries. There's things that are like, okay, there's going to be a reveal happening very soon, like in just a chapter or two. Hugo's like, there's going to be a reveal soon. I'm going to lay down hints and clues that lets you guess the answer to this mystery, that lets you guess what the reveal is going to be, like just moments before the huge reveal actually happens. And that happened so many times. There were so many moments where I was like, I think I'm catching something that he's writing. Like, this is something that he's very purposely hinting at. I'm going to try to interpret this. And I would like kind of put my brain to work and be like, okay, I'm putting this together, get a little bit further. And then I would come to a point where it's just like, I know the answer. This is what the reveal and like the next chapter is going to be. And then he would do the reveal in the next chapter, and it was like, wow, I guess that like right on time, just with the clues that he was pointing out. And it was this was also part of what immersed me into the book as well. It's like, I've never been able to read a book before where I just was so immersed in it that I could just guess at this stuff and feel like I was there, and also putting pieces together that way. And Hugo very clearly did this intentionally. It was just so well done. I loved it a ton. There was also huge emotional impact for me. The general stories of the characters, but also within the setting, had a very huge impact on me. There were some characters whose fates were like, wow, that was not what I was expecting, but it really hit me hard. The very end of the book was very good for this reason. and this kind of ties into the next point of something that I love, just being the prose. The very last, oh, what was it? It was one of the last paragraphs. So some of the last paragraphs of the book, right before technically the very final chapter, has one of my favorite quotes in all of fiction, just period. Within the book, the prose of the book is fantastic. This translation is insanely good. Like, going so far as, like, I did not notice a single copy edit error besides one instance of the wrong quotations being used. This was used where, like, you use the inverted commas for quotes, and then, you know, the actual quotation marks for quotes within quotes. There was one instance of these being used backwards, and then I think there was one other instance of something else. But besides these two very minor errors, there is nothing wrong with this book. You can tell, and a ton of care was put not into just the translation, but into the readability of it, the fact that it flows so well, and just the actual publication. Like, someone was like, this translation is really good, it's really in-depth, let's not hamper it by a bunch of stupid, pointless copy edits. There have been translations I've read of other books that have been like, wow, how did you manage to make this many errors just in the language of it? This book has none of those issues. So if you want a very smooth reading experience, I personally recommend this translation highly. Not just because it's the only one I've read, but because it's genuinely just a really good translation. And like I said, my favorite paragraph, potentially in all of fiction, happens on the last page here. Although, you know, even if I wasn't worried about any form of spoilery context, the main reason that that paragraph hits so hard is because of the 13 pages that come before it. So, you know, that kind of has a little bit of impact there. But I think I've talked enough about what I loved about this book. Let's talk about some things that maybe some other people didn't love quite as much. Some people don't like some of the relationships and or characters. Like I mentioned, some people don't love Marius and his relationship within this book. Some people don't find to be absolutely believable. I don't necessarily disagree with them in the sense that, like, oh, you're wrong. I just kind of look at it and think, well, like, I wasn't bothered by it. There were some aspects of that character and those relationships, though, that I did relate to in some degree from some of my younger years. So maybe that's part of me just, like, kind of inserting myself into the characters like I always do with basically any character of a book, regardless of they're the main character or not, but especially if they're one of the main characters, if they're the on-page character or the on-screen character or the POV character. I tend to do that a lot. But yeah, there are some characters and plot lines, or not plot lines, that's not what I was saying. There are some characters and relationships that some people don't find fully believable. That's fine. It's mostly just Marius, and his relationship is the one that I got from multiple people that was like, they don't necessarily enjoy that too much. Marius, like I said, some people don't like his character, and I think that's fine. I'm not going to get too miffed about that, but I personally disagree. Some of the plot events could be seen as contrivances or very lucky coincidences, you know, sort of along the lines of a Deus Ex Machina. This is the one aspect of the very tight plotting that Victor Hugo employed throughout this book that maybe is kind of like a problem in some sense, is just the fact that there are moments of this book where it's just like, okay, well, that could be seen as Deus Ex Machina, or like, that you're very lucky that those characters were in those places at those times, just like somehow. And I totally get that. I totally get that criticism, but for the purpose of the storytelling and for the tightness of the plotting, I think it's totally worth having those very minor contrivances. But I could see some people considering some moments of this book to, and it's not even like Deus Ex Machina, like a, you know, like, if this didn't happen for no reason, there's no way the book would have worked the way that it did, because it's not quite that bad. It's more just moments of, is it really that likely that that happened? And in all reality, it's not that likely that that happened that way. But like I said, it's never anything too crazy that I found it to be immersion breaking or story ruining. I thought that it enhanced the immersion of the actual story itself. And then one of my favorite moments emotionally, like I said, was kind of like in the last page of this book, you know, the last few chapters of the book. Some of my friends apparently didn't vibe with it all, and I was always rather surprised to hear that, and I don't understand that. This is one where it's just like, I don't understand that opinion, but there are occasionally some moments that may not hit as hard for you as maybe they did for me. But I feel like that's just kind of books in general. Maybe some things that don't hit as hard for me hit very hard for you, or vice versa. So it just all worked so well for me personally. In terms of the ugly, and this is going to be the main problem, so to speak, with the book, is tangents upon tangents upon tangents. Now, I'm not going to excuse these tangents saying, oh, like, they're part of the reading experience, just read them, like, it's part of the book, duh. No, like, I liked pretty much all of the tangents, but many will hate most of the tangents. There was only one or two tangents where I just genuinely disliked them, and the ones that did happen that I disliked for one reason or another, I did eventually grow to appreciate later for one reason or another. So it all eventually ended up working out for me. Waterloo is a great example of a tangent that actually I think most people enjoyed that tangent, but that was one that I just really did not enjoy, but later through different events of the story really grew to like and appreciate for what it was. And because it had like some story significance with a couple specific characters that was like really interesting to find out about later, that I thought genuinely just made it worth it, even if it was maybe a couple chapters too long. But the good news is the bloat of Les Mis is almost all relegated to these tangents. If you cut out these tangents, if you cut out these books within Les Mis that are just about a pretty much unrelated topic, or a topic that is unrelated enough that it doesn't need to be there, even if it's for context, you can skip over those. This is probably the easiest book in the world, especially of this length, to abridge, because all of the important story is in... It's just fantastic, and the parts that are just tangents and that are, you know, seemingly pointless are just those books, and you could cut them out or just skip over them and you miss very little to nothing depending on what those tangents are. So a book like Waterloo, for example, it was notably one of my least favorite parts of the book, especially when I read it. Is one that maybe if you cut it out, you're missing a tiny bit of context for a couple characters because of a couple chapters in there that are sort of important for later on, that, you know, become information for a character that's just like, you know, that's actually kind of worth knowing. But there are some tangents, such as one of the famous examples being the sewers under Paris. There is an entire book about this for some reason. Sure, in the actual story there is stuff going on in these sewers, so there didn't need to be this tangent about the sewers themselves, historically speaking. That's fine. Some of those tangents you could skip over. If I were to actually like look through and study this book again, I could probably compile a list of which books are just like completely pointless and are like, you don't need to read these, like this doesn't actually matter for the story. And if you want to skip the bloat, if you want to skip the tangents, just skip these books, and you can read all of the rest of it as if it's just the main story, and you get all of the main story without it being interrupted by these tangents. So I totally get that. Basically all of the tangents are a huge drawback of the unabridged version of the book, but I wouldn't recommend checking out the abridged version of the book, because I think the abridged version that I've seen is so short there's no way it actually contains all of the story. It cuts out basically everything, including the story. It's really weird. But there is a way to take the unabridged version of Les Mis and make it an abridged version that contains all of the important stuff and cuts out all the tangents and doesn't cut out anything that is substantially important. But with that being said, in terms of a recommendation, how would I recommend Les Mis? It's kind of a little bit of a hard one to recommend for this reason, and especially given that there was such a mixed reception to it for the read-along. You had people like me who just really loved it and loved everything about it. One of my friends, Patrick, similarly enjoyed it to I did, you know, to a degree similar to which that I did, but he doesn't really like Marius's character and thus the relationship that goes along with it a whole lot, but that was really the only thing that he, you know, substantially disliked. And then I had some other friends that really liked the first couple volumes of the book, but did not really like anything else. There were some people who really liked all the great, you know, all the story stuff, but thought that the tangents were a little overboard and just needed to be cut out. And, you know, that's a completely valid opinion as well. Like I just said, it would be the easiest book to, you know, abridge in the world. You just cut out the tangents and you basically have a book that's like 400 or 500 pages shorter. And you basically have a book that's like 300-400 pages shorter without cutting out any substantially important information. But I do recommend that everybody at least give this a shot if they're already interested in it. I like to tease about being butthurt when people don't like this book. You know, my friends, we kind of go through this a lot. It's the book that's like, if people talk about it in a disparaging way, I'll I'll kind of freak out, and I'll, you know, have a fake meltdown. I'll just kind of playfully make fun of them for disliking the book. But the truth is that I do totally understand if the book doesn't work for you, or if certain people don't like certain things about it. I totally recommend, though, that you do give it a shot. If you don't love volume 1, don't continue. That's going to be the litmus test for the book. If you read the book and you really enjoy volume 1, it's worth continuing. If you really enjoy volumes 1 and 2, again, still worth continuing. Volume 3 is going to be a little bit more of that like, okay, is it really worth continuing? I think it is, because volume 5, I think, is the best one besides volume 1 and 2. The 3 is probably overall my least favorite of the 5 volumes. But yeah, if you don't just like love volumes 1 and 2, or if you don't heavily enjoy them, you know, if there's nothing that you're getting out of the book by the end of volume 2 at the very latest, it's not the book for you, and that's fine. But if you are really enjoying it, I do suggest you continue and at least see if it's for you. It's one that I got so much out of, and I enjoyed reading so much that if I had stopped when I just was really bored with it in the Waterloo chapter, or when the first few books of volume 3 occur, when what you're reading doesn't seem to be important until suddenly it is, it's just like, oh yeah, okay, now all of that makes sense. But if I were to have quit this book in any of the difficult moments, I wouldn't have gotten the impact of it. And a lot of this book is still stuck in my head to this day. I just loved it so much, and I do think that it is worth giving a shot. But like I said, if you don't enjoy volume 1 very much, maybe don't continue. It's not the book for you. But if you do give it a shot and you're willing to get through the tangents, or if maybe you want someone to compile a list of the tangents that you are perfectly free to skip, and therefore you can enjoy the book without those interruptions, and you might just find a favorite book in this like I did. So yeah, that is my review of the book. It was a little bit of a longer video, at least in the review sphere. I haven't done a review that was this long in a little while, but I thought that this video deserved it. Partially, you know, as kind of a happy birthday to me. I got to talk about a book that I really loved as sort of a celebratory thing for my birthday. So thank you guys for watching this video. I'll be back this Thursday with another reading diary, but this time not for the Wheel of Time, for something a little bit different. So I hope you are excited to check out that video. If you're interested in it, obviously subscribe so that you can see it. And then I will be back on Thursday with that video. Next week, I'll be doing a review of the Dragon Reborn third book in the Wheel of Time, which is a series that I've been thoroughly enjoying. That review is a little bit shorter, but yeah, if you're interested in any of that stuff, I hope you stick around to check it out. Otherwise, I will see you guys in the next video.